Hello, this is Elizabeth, and I am the Catholic Lady Talks, and we are currently reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell, and we are at chapter 49. All had been the reverse of peaceful in Jerusalem during Saul's long and many absences. The Christians, or the Nazarenes as their fellow Jews still called them in the city, and especially the young men, had joined with the Essenes and the Zealots and were led into a desperate situation by the zealot Eleazar. He lured them into turbulent and deadly struggle with the Romans, saying that the time had come to free their beloved country. Whether or not he was a true Christian, Saul had not been able to learn from the letters he had received from Jerusalem, but it was evident that Eleazar was a violent man and was employing the Nazarenes to take our people from bondage, as the Messiah had promised. So fierce and savage was the uprising that nearly 30,000 Jews, both faithful and Nazarene, were slaughtered bloodily in the temple Purlius, and the Roman procurator declared a state of revolution and anarchy. Eleazar was found and publicly executed, and the bitterest of hatreds rose among the people. The families of the Jews who were murdered blamed those deaths on the Nazarenes, and now considered the heretics to be their mortal enemies, who brought down slaughter and death and ruin on all Jews. They detested the renegade Jews more profoundly than they detested the Gentile Nazarenes, who were not the Christian Gentiles the humblest and generally the most peaceable of the workers in their midst? But the heretics included some of the more intelligent and wealthiest and educated members of the Jewish people. And therefore they should have restrained Eleazar and his zealots and not made common cause with them against the Romans. Revolutionaries, brigands, outlaws, they cried to the Christians. You betray your own people and lead them to the slaughterhouse. Now it was said that all the churches established throughout the civilized world by the apostles and evangelists were subversive and were instigating riots, upheavals against Rome. Once Saul had been denounced to the Romans in Jerusalem. He is a plague carrier, a fomenter of revolt against all the Jews of the empire, which he detests. This had been taken so seriously by the emperor in Rome that he had warned the Jews of Alexandria not to receive missionaries unless they wished to be condemned as participants in a pest which threatens the whole world now. To the Romans, there was no significant difference between the Nazarene Jews and the faithful Jews, for the new sect was but a Jewish sect, now led by the most irresponsible and murderous of the Zealots and Essenes. Saul had known of these things, and he knew he was considered a zealot by Jew and Roman alike. His appearance in Jewish synagogues throughout the world during his travels was greeted with dismay at first, and then was tolerated, and later was cursed. He would bring fresh death and persecution and forced exile on his people. He must, therefore, be avoided at all cost. He had caused the first Jewish war against the Romans. The Jews were determined that he would not cause another. They heard with sorrow and despair that the synagogues in Rome, among the more prosperous, had been closed by the emperor for fear of a mounting revolution. When the Nazarenes ceased their worship in the synagogues in Rome, the emperor permitted their reopening. But the bitterness and the terror remained, and now the cleavage between the Nazarenes and their fellow Jews was complete. The Nazarene youths, wrote the historian Josephus later, are unkempt, savage, intolerant, lawless, alas, and their very appearance excites Roman animosity, for they appear as barbarians and not part of a civilized community. They walk and talk offensively and with open sneers at authority and defy established government in all nations. They engage in pitched battles with guards in the cities and hurl unmentionable weapons upon those guards and the soldiers. shouting that the return of the Messiah is at hand, and they were in the vanguard of his army. In Israel, the Essenes and the Zealots, so many of them now Nazarenes, became a particular object of the frightened hatred of the Jews. Therefore, they refused to listen to their message and all sympathy for them, as patriotic Jews opposed to the Romans disappeared. In other parts of the world, Saul was received with resentment and fury by his fellow Jews as a potential troublemaker and revolutionary, and so a threat to their lives. In vain, he pleaded that his kingdom is not of this world, and that freedom from bondage meant freedom of the soul from death and sin. They thought this a mere sophistry, and so did the Romans. So Saul returned to Jerusalem to reconcile both Jews and Christian Jews, and to save the church there. On the journey, he was often overcome by despair. He feared for the Christian community in Israel, and deplored the excesses of the Christian zealots and the Essenes. He had written to them while in Athens, "While we proclaim the Messianic age, for it has truly arrived, we insist that the law is still in force. For it is immortal, and was given by God. Blessed be his name. Alas, that the zealots believe that the Messianic age compels them to throw off all restraint, and to engage in riot and incendiarisms and physical attacks and disobedience. For the Lord is the Prince of Peace, not the leader of violence and murder and hatred between brothers." He had been even more disturbed at receiving information from Jerusalem that the Gentile converts were misinterpreting the Messiah and were using his very name to incite trouble. As these converts were in the main former slaves and freedmen, and of random races and artisans and malcontents and desirous of riches promised by the Messiah, they mischievously mocked the Roman military on the streets of Jerusalem and caused much disturbance and hostility. The Romans felt themselves and their empire threatened throughout the world, and were aghast at the incredible spread of the Messianic message in every nation. Saul found matters in Israel much worse than even his vivid imagination had imagined. Simon Peter, the bishop of the Christian community, had left for Rome with the desire to bring order and comfort to the Christians, and to allay the terrors of his fellow Jews. Saul learned of all this in Joppa, the seaport where he remained for a few days. Joppa, though it stank, as did all cities, was still swept by the winds of the sea, freshening and stimulating. The streets were like stairs, one above the other, and walled and paved with blocks of marble and sandstone, and wound precipitously, and were so narrow that overhanging balconies almost touched. The windows, which looked out upon the streets, were grilled and slit-like, and there were meager little shops set into the walls below. Huge flocks of gulls lifted like metallic gold shavings flung against the hyacinth skies, and glittered, and everywhere where there was a spot of bare ground rose the green clouds of tamarisk and sycamore trees, and the knife-like emerald green blades of palms, and the counters of the little shops were heaped with citrons, green and yellow, and cakes and meats and fabrics and spices. Over all was the chuckling and the wash of the sea, and strong sea-borne winds, and the cries of children and the complaints of animals. Saul found the house of Simon the tanner, and remained there for a space while they discussed the precarious situation of the Jewish Jerusalem community, beset within and without. Simon was a crooked little man with a satirish grin and small dancing eyes and clever hands, and he made elaborate purses and pouches as well as sandals and boots, and was not a man to take life too seriously, as he explained to Saul. What came of a somber countenance and fears and premonitions and terrors? A bad digestion. And in that gloom the soul was cut off from the life-giving Son of God. Blessed be his name. To fear was to doubt God, and were not all things in his hands? Saul looked at the small and malformed face and wondered if Simon were secretly jesting at him. "I have loved greatly, and I have lost greatly," said Simon, in his shrill womanish voice. "But I endured, and I survived. What avail is it to complain? The Jerusalem community will survive, if God wills it, and it will not survive if he wills it." "God's failures were really man's failures," said Saul with bitterness. "It is easy to throw all onto the shoulders of God and do nothing. But we are called to labor, even if the result is his own. What else can we do?" Simon went to the door of his odorous little shop and looked out at the sky and the gulls, and then over the shelves of the street to the brilliant blue sea. Waves were coming in, tall and rapid, as they crashed on the beach, and they were pure flash of white fire, hurtful to the eyes. Simon blinked. "What else can we do?" repeated Simon. "We can only do our best, and if that fail, it is not our failure, for it was ordained." After a moment he said, "I have lost many. I have loved to the Romans, and I know that it is appointed for men to die once, as you have said yourself, Saul of Tarshish. What matter when a man dies? If life is so beautiful and so desirable that we must strain all measures of juices from it, even from the seeds and the rinds and the gall, as women strain the juices of citrons or pomegranates, let us not yearn for the pulp and the bitterness of the refuse, greedily like goats, unwilling to put down the cup. The sweet first juice is enough." This seemed to Saul to echo the very words of his old teacher Aristo, for they had a cynical overtone and a faint hint of laughter. Excuse me. But looking at Simon's gnarled face and the dark, deep sorrow in his eyes, Saul knew that he spoke out of wisdom and not out of jest. Still, it was not consoling, and Saul soon took his leave. He journeyed to Jerusalem in a small car rented from an inn in Joppa, and on the way to the beloved city he brooded and thought. We'll begin again with part 2 of chapter 49.